The winter of 1874 brought the kind of cold that could kill a man in Wyoming Territory, the sort that froze breath into crystals and turned fingertips blue within minutes. Quinn Anderson had been riding the fence line of his modest cattle ranch when he spotted what looked like a bundle of rags in the distance, something out of place in the pristine white landscape. It wasn't until the bundle moved that he realized it was a person. The howling wind nearly drowned out the weak cry for help. Quinn spurred his horse forward, his heart hammering against his ribs as the snow crunched beneath the animal's hooves. As he drew closer, he made out the form of a woman, her dress dusted with snow, her gloved hands clutching at her swollen belly. "Madam," Quinn called, dismounting with practiced ease despite the cold making his joints stiff. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of summer cornflowers. "Please," she whispered, her lips blue from the cold. "My baby." Quinn knelt beside her, taking in her condition with growing alarm. She was heavily pregnant, perhaps within weeks of her time, and dangerously cold. Her face was pale as the snow around them, save for her cheeks, which were flushed with exertion or fever, he couldn't tell which. "I need to get you somewhere warm," he said, his voice gruff with concern. "My cabin's a few miles east. Can you tell me your name?" "Ruby," she managed through chattering teeth. "Ruby Lawson. I'm Quinn Anderson. I'm going to carry you to my horse, Miss Lawson, and then to my cabin. You're going to be all right." He wasn't sure if his words were meant to reassure her or himself. The woman Ruby nodded weakly, and Quinn carefully slid his arms beneath her, one supporting her back, the other under her knees. Her body felt fragile in his arms, but the swell of her belly reminded him of the precious life she carried. With a grunt, Quinn lifted her. She was lighter than he expected, despite her condition, and that worried him. How long had she been out here? Where had she come from? There wasn't another homestead for 20 miles that he knew of. "My wagon," Ruby murmured as he carried her toward his horse. "It broke down." "I thought I could walk." Save your strength," Quinn told her, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "We'll worry about that later." He managed to get her onto his horse, then mounted behind her, cradling her against his chest to share what warmth he could. The ride back to his cabin seemed interminable, each jolt causing Ruby to whimper softly. Quinn murmured reassurances into her hair, which smelled faintly of lavender despite the cold and circumstances. By the time his cabin came into view, Ruby had fallen silent, and fear gripped Quinn's heart. He couldn't remember the last time he'd moved so quickly, dismounting with her in his arms and kicking the door open with his boot. Inside, embers still glowed in the hearth from the morning's fire, and he thanked whatever providence had made him build it up well before leaving. Laying Ruby on his bed, Quinn worked frantically to stoke the fire back to life, adding kindling and logs until flames leapt high. He returned to Ruby, removing her snow-dampened cloak and outer garments, replacing them with his own worn but clean flannel shirt. Her skin was so cold it frightened him. "Ruby," he called, patting her cheek gently. "Miss Lawson, stay with me now." Her eyelids fluttered, and she looked at him with confusion before recognition dawned. "The baby," she whispered. I think it's coming." Quinn's blood ran cold despite the growing warmth of the cabin. "The baby, now?" Ruby nodded weakly, her face contorting with a pain that seemed to pass through her like a wave. "Yes," she gasped. "I can feel it. I'll fetch the doctor," Quinn said, rising to his feet, but Ruby's hand shot out with surprising strength, catching his wrist. "No time," she said. "The storm's getting worse. You'll have to help me." Quinn had delivered countless calves in his years as a rancher, but this was different. This was a beautiful, vulnerable woman whose life and that of her child now rested in his calloused, work-roughened hands. "I don't know how," he admitted, his voice cracking. Ruby's eyes met his, clear despite her pain. "I do. I was a midwife's assistant back east. I can guide you." Over the next several hours, Quinn learned more about courage than he had in his 30 years of life. Ruby Lawson, despite her weakened state, directed him with remarkable composure, telling him what to boil, what to prepare, when to support her, when to give her space. And through it all, through her cries of pain and moments of exhaustion, she never once lost her dignity. As night fell outside and the wind howled around the cabin's walls, Ruby gave one final, tremendous push, and a new cry joined the symphony of the storm, the lusty wail of a newborn baby girl. "She's here," Quinn whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he held the tiny, squirming infant. "Ruby, she's here and she's perfect." He cleaned the baby as Ruby had instructed and wrapped her in a clean shirt before placing her in her mother's arms. Ruby's face, though etched with exhaustion, glowed with a joy that transformed her. She looked up at Quinn, tears spilling from her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved us both." Quinn felt something shift inside him as he looked at mother and child, something he hadn't felt in a very long time, perhaps ever. He pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on practical matters. "You both need rest," he said, his voice gruff with unexpressed emotion. "I'll make some broth, and then you should sleep." In the days that followed, Quinn learned Ruby's story in pieces, between feedings and changings and the quiet moments when the baby whom Ruby had named Hope slept peacefully. Ruby had been traveling west to join her cousin in Idaho after the death of her husband in a mining accident back in Pennsylvania. She was alone in the world except for Hope and this distant relative she barely knew. "The wagon wheel broke about 5 miles from here," she explained on the third day, sitting up in bed with Hope nestled against her chest. "I thought I could walk to find help, but the snow started falling harder and I got turned around." "It's a miracle I found you," Quinn said, sitting in the chair he'd pulled up beside the bed. He'd been sleeping on a pallet by the fire, giving Ruby and Hope his bed. Ruby's eyes met his, that cornflower blue that had begun to haunt his dreams. "Yes," she said simply, "a miracle." As the storm raged outside, keeping them confined to the cabin, Quinn found himself revealing his own past to Ruby. He told her about coming west at 18, working cattle drives until he saved enough to buy his small spread. He spoke of the loneliness of the frontier, the hard winters and harder men, and how he'd built his life with his own 2 hands. "No family?" Ruby asked one evening as they sat before the fire, Hope sleeping soundly in a makeshift cradle Quinn had fashioned from a wooden crate. Quinn shook his head. "Lost my pa to the war when I was 12, my ma to consumption 2 years later, been on my own since." Ruby reached across the space between them and laid her hand on his. Her touch was gentle, and Quinn found himself turning his palm up to hold hers. "Not anymore," she said softly. When the storm finally broke a week later, Quinn rode out to recover Ruby's wagon and what belongings he could salvage. He found the wagon where she'd described, half buried in snow but otherwise intact save for the broken wheel. He loaded her trunks onto his horse and repaired the wheel enough to drag the wagon back to his property. Upon his return, he found Ruby up and about, Hope swaddled against her chest as she moved slowly around the cabin. She'd swept the floor and somehow managed to prepare a stew that filled the cabin with a savory aroma Quinn hadn't experienced in years. "You shouldn't be up," he scolded gently, stomping snow from his boots. Ruby smiled, and Quinn felt that now familiar tug in his chest. "I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Anderson. Besides, I can't expect you to wait on me hand and foot forever." "Quinn," he corrected her, "and I don't mind." Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary, and Quinn felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the fire or his exertions. That evening, as they ate the stew Ruby had prepared, Quinn cleared his throat nervously. "I brought back your wagon and belongings. The wheel's fixed well enough for travel, though I'd recommend having it properly repaired in town before you continue your journey." Ruby's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "Oh, yes, of course. I should continue on to Idaho as soon as possible. My cousin is expecting me." The thought of Ruby and Hope leaving created a hollow feeling in Quinn's stomach. He'd grown accustomed to their presence, to the sounds of life filling his once quiet cabin. The idea of returning to his solitary existence was suddenly unbearable. "There's no rush," he said quickly. "The pass won't be clear for another few weeks at least, and you and Hope should regain your strength before traveling." Relief flickered across Ruby's face. "If you're sure we're not imposing." "You're not," Quinn assured her. "Not at all." As January gave way to February, Quinn found reasons to delay their departure. First, it was the continued snowfall making travel treacherous. Then, a bout of colic that kept Hope fussy and Ruby exhausted. By March, they had fallen into a comfortable routine, with Ruby taking charge of the cabin while Quinn tended to his cattle and the daily chores of the ranch. One crisp morning, Quinn returned from checking on a pregnant heifer to find Ruby standing in the doorway of the cabin, Hope bundled against the chill as they watched him approach. "You're getting soft, Quinn Anderson," Ruby called as he dismounted. "Letting that old cow take up space in your barn when she could be out with the others," Quinn grinned, leading his horse to the small stable. "She's earned special treatment, been with me since I started this place." Ruby followed him, Hope cooing and reaching for Quinn as they drew near. Without thinking, Quinn took the baby from Ruby's arms and Hope immediately grabbed at his beard with chubby fingers. "She likes you," Ruby observed, her voice soft. "Feelings mutual," Quinn replied, gently disengaging Hope's grip and handing her back to Ruby. Their hands brushed in the exchange and Quinn felt that now familiar spark. That night after Hope was asleep, Ruby joined Quinn by the fire. "I received a letter from my cousin today," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "The mail finally got through from town." Quinn's heart sank. "Oh." "She writes that she and her husband have decided to move back east. Her husband's father is ill and they're needed to run the family business." Ruby twisted her hands in her lap. "She says there's no place for me there now." Quinn tried to hide his relief. "I'm sorry to hear that." Ruby looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Are you, really?" Quinn met her gaze steadily. "I'm sorry for your disappointment," he said honestly, "but I'm not sorry that you might stay longer." "Quinn," Ruby began, then hesitated. "I don't know what to do now. I have some money saved, but not enough to establish myself somewhere new. Hope and I—" "Stay," Quinn said, the word bursting from him before he could consider it. "Stay here with me." Ruby's eyes widened. "Here, but I know it's sudden," Quinn rushed on. "And I know we've only known each other a short time, but Ruby, these past weeks, having you and Hope here, it's like I finally found something I didn't even know I was missing." Ruby's expression softened. "Quinn, I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," he assured her quickly. "You can have the cabin and I'll build another for myself nearby, or we can find you a place in town if you prefer. I don't want you to go." Ruby stood and crossed to where he sat, kneeling before him and taking his hands in hers. "Quinn Anderson," she said, her voice steady despite the tears glistening in her eyes. "Are you asking me to stay as your housekeeper or as something more?" Quinn swallowed hard. "I'm asking you to stay however you want to stay, but I won't deny that I've grown to care for you, Ruby." "For both of you," Ruby's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds after a storm. "I've grown to care for you too, Quinn, more than I thought possible after losing Thomas." "Your husband," Quinn said, the name unfamiliar on his tongue. Ruby nodded. "He was a good man and I mourned him deeply, but life goes on, doesn't it? And sometimes, if we're very lucky, it gives us a second chance at happiness." Quinn reached out tentatively, brushing a strand of hair from Ruby's face. "Is that what this could be, a second chance?" "I think it could," Ruby whispered, "if we're brave enough to take it." Their first kiss was gentle, questioning, the touch of two people who had known loss and were cautious with hope. But when they parted, Quinn saw in Ruby's eyes the same certainty he felt in his heart. As spring arrived in earnest, Quinn and Ruby settled into a new understanding. They moved slowly, mindful of Hope and the bonds they were forming. Quinn began expanding the cabin, adding a proper bedroom for Hope and improving the main living area. Ruby planted a garden and acquired chickens from a neighbor, bringing new life to the homestead. Their first real test came in late April when a group of rustlers attempted to steal several of Quinn's cattle. Quinn confronted them, taking a bullet in the shoulder for his trouble. He managed to drive them off with his own gunfire, but by the time he returned to the cabin, he was weak from blood loss and feverish. Ruby tended him with the same calm competence she'd shown during Hope's birth, cleaning and bandaging his wound, brewing willow bark tea for the pain and fever. For 3 days, Quinn drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling Ruby's name, sometimes muttering about the cattle or the ranch. On the fourth day, he woke clear-headed to find Ruby asleep in a chair beside his bed, Hope cradled in her arms. The sight squeezed his heart with an emotion so powerful it took his breath away. "Ruby," he whispered, his voice hoarse. She stirred immediately, her eyes flying open. "Quinn, how do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd," he admitted with a weak smile, "but better. Thanks to you." Ruby carefully laid Hope in her cradle before returning to Quinn's side, laying a cool hand on his forehead. "Your fever's broken. I was so worried." "It'll take more than a few rustlers to keep me down," Quinn assured her, though in truth he'd had moments when he feared he wouldn't make it. "Ruby, while the fever had me, I realized something." "What's that?" she asked, her hand moving to brush his hair back from his forehead in a gesture so tender it made his throat tight. "I realized I don't want to waste any more time," Quinn said. "Life out here is uncertain. Those men could have killed me and I would have died without telling you." He paused, gathering his courage. "Without telling you that I love you, Ruby Lawson." Ruby's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Quinn, I know it hasn't been long," he continued, "and I know you've been through so much." "If you need more time, I don't," Ruby interrupted, taking his hand and pressing it to her cheek. "I love you too, Quinn. I think I have since you carried me through that blizzard, since you helped bring hope into the world. You're a good man, a kind man, and I don't want to waste any more time either." When Quinn was strong enough to stand, he asked Ruby to marry him properly, down on one knee despite the protestation of his healing shoulder. Ruby accepted with tears and laughter, and Hope seemed to approve, babbling happily from her mother's arms. They were married by a traveling preacher in May, a simple ceremony attended by the few neighbors scattered across the nearby countryside. Quinn had never seen Ruby look more beautiful than she did in her blue dress with wildflowers in her hair, and Hope, dressed in a tiny white gown Ruby had sewn, in her arms. That night, after they had put Hope to bed in her new room, Quinn took Ruby's hand and led her to what was now their bedroom. Their coming together was both tender and passionate, the culmination of months of growing love and the promise of a shared future. As summer bloomed across the Wyoming landscape, so too did their small family flourish. Quinn taught Ruby to ride, and soon she was helping with the cattle, proving to be a natural horsewoman. Ruby expanded her garden and began selling excess produce and eggs in town, adding to their modest income. Hope grew from a newborn to a curious, active baby, crawling across the cabin floor and pulling herself up on furniture, her laughter filling their home. In July, Ruby shared news that filled Quinn with both terror and joy. She was expecting again. This time, Quinn insisted on riding to town for the doctor when her time came in late winter, refusing to take any chances despite Ruby's assurances that all would be well. Their son, Thomas Quinn Anderson, was born during a gentle snowfall in February 1875, almost exactly 1 year after Quinn had found Ruby collapsed in the snow. As Quinn held his son for the first time, looking down at Ruby with Hope snuggled beside her on the bed, he marveled at how completely his life had changed in the span of a year. "What are you thinking?" Ruby asked, reaching up to touch his face. Quinn smiled, his heart so full he thought it might burst. "I'm thinking about tracks in the snow," he said, "and how sometimes they lead exactly where you're meant to go." Ruby's answering smile was radiant. "I got lost in that storm," she said softly, "but I found my way home." Years passed, and the Anderson ranch prospered. Quinn and Ruby added to both their family and their property, eventually building a larger house to accommodate their growing brood. Hope grew into a spirited young woman with her mother's blue eyes and a talent for healing that eventually led her to become the town's midwife. Thomas followed in his father's footsteps, learning the ranching business from the ground up. The winters in Wyoming remained harsh, but Quinn and Ruby faced them together, just as they faced everything life threw their way. And on cold nights, when the wind howled around their home, they would often tell their children the story of how their family began with a desperate journey, a snowstorm, and the courage to carry one another through the darkest days toward the light of a shared future. On the 20th anniversary of the day Quinn found Ruby in the snow, they stood together on the porch of their home, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Quinn's hair had silvered at the temples, and Ruby's face bore the gentle lines of a life well lived, but when he looked at her, Quinn still saw the brave young woman who had guided him through delivering their first child. "Any regrets?" Quinn asked, his arm around her waist. Ruby leaned her head against his shoulder. "Not a single one." As the sun set over the Wyoming mountains, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, Quinn Anderson knew with absolute certainty that the greatest journey of his life had begun that winter day when he'd spotted a bundle of rags in the snow and found, instead, the love of his life.